voice that burned too bright. The story does not begin with fame. It begins with rain. Endless sheets of rain falling over Aberdeen, Washington, where a boy named Kurt Cobain learned early what it meant to feel small in a world that never seemed to notice him. He was never meant to fit, his aunt once said, years after he was gone. And those who knew him nodded, because even as a child, Kurt seemed to move on a different frequency. While other kids chased baseballs in mud, he lingered on the edges, sketching cartoons in the margins of school notebooks, humming Beatles melodies under his breath. His laughter, when it came, was fleeting, like a spark quickly swallowed by shadows. Then came the fracture. At 9 years old, Kurt watched the two people who were supposed to anchor him drift apart. His parents' divorce cracked something deep inside him. Overnight, his world collapsed. 1 week he was living with his mother. The next he was pushed into the homes of relatives, shuffled like an unwanted package. Each house felt colder than the last. Each adult too distracted to notice the quiet boy with the sad blue eyes. The school hallways were no refuge. He was too small, too fragile, too different. His clothes were hand-me-downs, his mannerisms eccentric, his energy both shy and restless. The other kids smelled weakness and attacked. They shoved him into lockers, mocked his voice, branded him an outcast before he even had a chance to decide who he was. Every insult pressed deeper into him until he carried his own body like a burden. But in that isolation, something else was being born. At night, Kurt filled journals with sketches and scribbled words, poems, fragmented thoughts, pieces of himself he could not share out loud. He was already writing songs before he knew they were songs. And when he first wrapped his hands around a guitar, it was like plugging his veins directly into sound. The vibrations shook loose the heaviness inside him. For the first time, he felt heard, even if only by himself. That guitar became his weapon, his diary, his only friend. The more he played, the more his voice emerged, raw, unpolished, cracked in places but drenched with emotion. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to impress. It was the voice of someone trying to survive. Each note seemed to carry the weight of abandonment, the humiliation of being invisible, the fury of being misunderstood. Unknowingly, Kurt had begun singing for an entire generation, though the world hadn't heard him yet. The outcasts, the kids hiding behind long hair and silence, the ones who felt life pressing down on them. They were waiting. They were searching for a voice that told them they weren't alone. But Kurt could not see that future. Not yet. All he knew was that he had pain, a guitar, and a voice that burned too brightly to be ignored. A fire was beginning to spread inside him, and like all wildfires, it promised both light and destruction. The making of an outsider. The story of Kurt's teenage years begins not with triumph, but with suffocation. Aberdeen, Washington, rain-soaked, gray and small, was a town where dreams rusted as quickly as the metal at the old logging mills. For most kids, life had a script. Graduate, work at the mill, settle down, disappear into the rhythm of repetition. But Kurt Cobain was never going to follow that script. He couldn't. Everywhere he turned, he carried the weight of rejection. His father, who once cheered him on at Little League games, had long since drifted away. His mother, overwhelmed by her own struggles, seemed distant too. Kurt was left afloat between relatives' homes, each stop a reminder that he didn't belong anywhere. By the time he entered high school, he wasn't just an outsider. He was a ghost walking the hallways, too strange to be ignored, but too quiet to be understood. Kids mocked him for his clothes, his size, his awkwardness. They shoved him, laughed at him, and reminded him daily of his difference. And yet, while they tried to break him down, Kurt began quietly building a world they could never touch. That world was music. When he discovered punk, it was like someone had handed him a key. The Ramones, the Melvins, Black Flag. These weren't polished stars. They were misfits who screamed their truth through distortion. Their songs sounded like chaos to most, but to Kurt, it was salvation. In their noise, he heard honesty. In their rebellion, he saw a map out of suffocation. His guitar was cheap, secondhand, often falling apart, but it became his anchor. He practiced until his fingers bled, chasing a sound that was raw enough to match the chaos inside him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to survive. every jagged riff, every cracked scream was a confession that no teacher, no parent, no doctor could ever draw out of him. Life outside music was harsher still. Kurt drifted in and out of homelessness, crashing on couches when he was lucky, curling under bridges when he wasn't. His stomach throbbed with chronic pain that no doctor could explain, leaving him doubled over in misery, yet still scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper. Poverty, pain, invisibility, these became his constant companions. And yet, he carried something powerful, an unrelenting need to turn suffering into sound. He played in garages, in tiny basements, in clubs where cigarette smoke clung to walls like ghosts. Sometimes the audience was only a handful of kids, but Kurt sang as though the entire world was listening, because in his bones, he believed one day it would. What no one in those dim, sweaty rooms realized was that they were watching history take its first breath, the boy who never fit and was about to give a generation its voice. But what Kurt could not yet see was a cruel irony, that the very voice which saved him from drowning would one day become the wave that pulled him under. A band called Nirvana. It started like most revolutions do, not in boardrooms, not in arenas, but in basements reeking of sweat, beer, and stale cigarettes. The first time Kurt Cobain played with Chris Novoselic, it didn't sound like history. It sounded messy, too loud, too rough, but in the chaos there was something undeniable, something alive. Kurt had found his mirror. Chris' towering figure and steady bass gave weight to Kurt's fragile but furious riffs. Together they shaped noise into something raw, something that felt like truth. They didn't care about perfection. They cared about impact. And slowly, that impact began to spread. Aberdeen was too small to hold them, so they carried their instruments into Seattle, a city pulsing with an underground scene that was hungry for new voices. Grunge wasn't a word yet. It was just kids in flannel shirts and torn jeans, trading tapes, screaming into microphones in half-empty clubs. But when Kurt stepped on those stages, something shifted. His voice, cracked and aching, cut through the smoke and sweat like a blade. People stopped talking. They listened. They felt. Nirvana was born out of this hunger, out of Kurt's desperation to turn pain into sound, with drummer Chad chanting. The early shows were chaotic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, but there was always a spark, a feeling that something bigger was waiting just around the corner. In 1989, they recorded Bleach with barely enough money to cover the studio fees. The album was raw, heavy, stitched together with distortion and defiance. It didn't storm the charts, but it carved a space for them in the underground, whisper about in zines, pass around on cassette tapes like contraband. For the first time, Kurt felt the weight of his voice reaching beyond the small town walls that once confined him. But success didn't quiet his demons. It amplified them. As the crowds grew, so did the pressure. Kurt wasn't chasing fame. He was running from despair. Yet the spotlight would begin to find him anyway. And with each performance, the contradiction inside him deepened. He wanted the world to hear him. Yet he feared what would happen when it finally did. In the back of his journals, he scribbled lines that sounded less like ambition and more like prophecy. I don't have the passion anymore, and so remember, it's better to burn out than to fade away. They were just words then, but like a storm gathering on the horizon, they hinted at a future darker than anyone in those crowded clubs could imagine. Nirvana was climbing, slowly but steadily, and the world was about to meet them. But with every step upward, Kurt carried the same haunting truth. The higher he rose, the further he would have to fall. Smells like teen spirit. It was the sound of a generation being born, though no one in the studio knew at the time. The riff began as a joke, a messy chord progression Kurt tossed out while fooling around. But when Dave Grohl's drums thundered in behind it, when Chris' bass rumbled beneath it, something electric filled the room. It was primal, urgent, undeniable. They recorded it quickly, almost carelessly, as if unaware that this one song, Smells Like Teen Spirit, would tear through the culture like a lightning strike. Within weeks of its release in 1991, it was everywhere. On MTV, blasting from car stereos, echoing through high school hallways. Kids who had never heard of Aberdeen, who had never cared about punk or underground scenes, were suddenly screaming Kurt's words at the top of their lungs. And just like that, Nirvana was no longer an underground band. They were the face of a movement, the voice of the misfits, the broken, the restless youth who felt suffocated by the plastic world their parents had built. Grunge wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an identity. Torn jeans, flannel shirts, unwashed hair, and most of all, an attitude that said, "We don't care about your rules." For Kurt, the transformation was dizzying. Only months earlier, he had been sleeping on floors, scraping together gas money just to make it to the next show. Now, Nirvana's album Nevermind was climbing past Michael Jackson on the charts. Overnight, the boy who once scribbled poems in the dark was being hailed as the voice of a generation. But behind the magazine covers and sold-out shows, Kurt was suffocating. Fame to him was not a dream fulfilled, but a nightmare realized. He never wanted to be a rock star. He wanted to be an artist. Yet everywhere he went, cameras followed. Strangers reached, expectations grew heavier. The world wanted him to lead a revolution he never asked for. The contradiction tore at him. On stage, he poured every ounce of himself into the songs, his voice shredding, his body collapsing against a guitar, as if each performance cost him years of his life. Off stage, he recoiled, hiding from interviews, fleeing from fans, numbing himself with drugs when the noise inside became unbearable. Courtney Love entered his life during this chaos, and with her came both solace and fire. Their love was volatile, electric, and consuming. Together they found comfort in their shared brokenness, but they also fueled each other's flames. To Kurt, Courtney was both refuge and mirror, someone who understood the void he carried, but also someone who carried her own storms. And then came Frances Bean, their daughter. For a moment, Kurt felt something he had long believed was lost. Purpose, holding her. He wrote of wanting to protect her innocence, of wishing to be the father he never had. But even that light was threatened by the darkness pressing in from all sides. Fame, addiction, pain, the gnawing fear that he wasn't enough. Smells Like Teen Spirit had given him everything he thought he wanted. Recognition, a stage, a voice that could not be ignored. But it had also chained him to a spotlight he could not escape. The higher Nirvana climbed, the more Kurt felt himself slipping, inch by inch, into a place he might never return from. The world saw a hero, Kurt saw a trap. And the question that haunted him in those sleepless nights was not whether he could carry the crown of his generation, but whether he wanted to live long enough to try. The price of being voiced. It is one thing to be heard. It is another thing to be trapped by the very echo of your own voice. By 1992, Kurt Cobain was no longer just a musician. He was an icon. His face stared out from every magazine rack. His voice blasted from radios across the world. He had become the reluctant prophet of a generation that felt invisible. And while the world worshipped him, he recoiled from the weight of their devotion. On stage, Kurt gave everything. Each show felt like a battlefield. His voice shredding with every scream, his body folding into the guitar as though he was trying to disappear inside the sound. Fans saw catharsis. Kurt felt exhaustion. He wanted to be seen as an artist, not a savior. But to the millions who clung to his words, Kurt Cobain was not just a singer. He was hope, rebellion, proof that their pain had a soundtrack. The irony was cruel. The more people loved him, the lonelier he became. Fame, to Kurt, was like a prison cell made of flashing cameras and endless expectations. Strangers wanted pieces of him, his music, his words, his soul, and soon he felt there was nothing left to give. Behind closed doors, the pressure curdled into despair. His stomach pain worsened, a gnawing torment that no doctor could cure. He drowned it in heroin, seeking relief in a haze that only deepened his dependence. The drugs dulled the physical pain, but they sharpened the shadows in his mind. Addiction became both comfort and curse, fueling his creativity while tightening its grip around his life. Courtney was there, fiercely protective, fiercely flawed, their love swinging between tenderness and chaos. Their daughter, Frances Bean, was a rare light in the storm. Kurt adored her, clung to her innocence, but at the same time he feared himself, feared the darkness he might pass down. In moments of clarity, he spoke of wanting to quit everything, The band, the tours, even the spotlight just to be a father. But the machine of fame was relentless. Contracts, managers, labels. They kept pulling him back onto stages he no longer wanted to stand on. The contradiction tore him apart. In interviews, he smiled, joked, sometimes lashed out. In journals, he confessed his deepest fears. I'm too sensitive. I need to be slightly numb just to regain the enthusiasm I once had as a child. He was living in two worlds, the public stage where he would crown a generation, and the private hell where he questioned if he wanted to live at all. The music reflected this fracture. Songs like All Apologies and Penny Royalty weren't just lyrics. They were confessions. He sang of exhaustion, of emptiness, of wanting to disappear. And the world sang along, never realizing they were chanting his farewell. By the time Nirvana headlined at Reading Festival in 1992, Kurt walked on stage in a hospital gown, mocking the rumors of his failing health. He played ferociously that night, delivering one of the most legendary performances in rock history. The crowd saw brilliance. But for Kurt, it was also a mask, another way to hide how broken he truly was. The higher the band soared, the more Kurt withdrew. He hated the circus of fame, yet couldn't stop the world from demanding more. Every cheer, every sold-out arena was a reminder that his pain had become entertainment. And in the quiet hours after the lights went out, he began to ask himself a question no one around him wanted to hear. How much longer can I keep living like this? The beginning of the end. The curtain was still up, the lights still blazing, but Kurt Cobain was already retreating into shadows no one else could follow. Fame had given him everything he thought he wanted: money, recognition, a stage big enough to hold his pain. But it had also stolen the one thing he needed most: peace. By 1993, Nirvana was the biggest band in the world. Their MTV Unplugged in New York performance would go on to become legendary. A raw, haunting show that stripped away distortion and revealed Kurt's voice in all its fragile beauty. Draped in flowers and candles, the set looked more like a funeral than a concert. And perhaps, deep down, that was the point. Each song bled like confession, each lyric trembling between brilliance and surrender. The audience thought it was art. For Kurt, it was goodbye, rehearsed in plain sight. Off stage, the spiral deepened. His heroin use became more consuming, less recreational and more survival. He was in and out of rehab, sometimes walking out only hours after checking in. Friends begged him to fight. Courtney pleaded. His bandmates watched helplessly as the man who had once ignited them on stage drifted further away. The contradictions inside him grew unbearable. He wanted to be a father to Frances, yet feared she would grow up hating him. He wanted to make music, yet dreaded every stage he stepped on. He wanted to live, yet longed for silence. Kurt's journals from that time read like a tug of war between hope and despair. One page filled with plans for songs, sketches, dreams of retreating into quiet domestic life. The next page a storm of anguish, words dripping with self-hatred and exhaustion. I don't feel the excitement anymore, he wrote. And the worst crime I can think of would be to rip people off by faking it. The pressure of being the voice of a generation felt like a noose. He never asked to be a spokesperson, never wanted to lead anyone. He only wanted to scream his truth into the void. But the world had made him a symbol, and now he could no longer separate himself from the image they demanded. In the rare moments of light, Kurt clung to Frances, her tiny hands, her laughter, the innocence that reminded him of a world untouched by pain. But even that love was haunted by doubt. Could he ever be the father she needed? Could he ever escape the storm inside himself long enough to raise her? The band tried to move forward. Tours, new music, interviews. Everything pushed Kurt further into a corner. He hated the cameras, hated the questions, hated the circus that followed him everywhere. Yet when he sang, something undeniable still happened. For a fleeting moment, he was free, but freedom was fleeting. And as 1994 approached, the whispers grew louder, the silences longer, and those closest to him began to fear what Kurt himself had already begun to accept. His fire was burning too quickly, and soon it would consume him. The last battle. There are moments in a life when the weight becomes unbearable. when the noise outside and the noise inside fused into one endless roar. For Kurt Cobain, 1994 was at breaking point. On stage, he still looked like the prophet of grunge. The flannel shirts, the blonde hair hanging in his face, the voice that could shift from a whisper to a scream in a heartbeat. Crowds of thousands screamed his words back at him as if they were scripture. But behind his eyes, there was a hollowness, a distance, as though Kurt was already somewhere else. Touring had become a nightmare. In March of 1994, Nirvana's European tour collapsed under the weight of Kurt's exhaustion and illness in Rome. He was rushed to the hospital after an overdose of pills and alcohol. Officially, it was called an accident, but those who knew him whispered that it was something more, a rehearsal for a final act he hadn't yet fully written. Rehab came next. Friends, managers, Courtney, all of them begged him to fight, to get clean, to stay alive. He checked into a facility in Los Angeles, and for a brief moment there was hope. Fans prayed. Headlines promised redemption, and Courtney told the press she believed in his recovery. But Kurt was not built for cages. Even cages meant to save him. Within days, he escaped, climbing a wall, disappearing into the city like a fugitive from his own life. What followed was silence. For nearly a week, no one knew where he was. Courtney called private investigators. Friends searched. Reporters speculated. But Kurt slipped into hiding, a man at war with himself, torn between the daughter he adored and the darkness that refused to loosen its grip. In those final days, Kurt seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, spotted by neighbors back in Seattle, wandering quietly, head down, as though trying to erase himself before the world could. Inside his home, he wrote notes, some tender, some furious, some incomprehensible. He played his guitar, not for an audience, but for himself for the last time. To those who saw him in those days, he seemed fragile, almost translucent. His blue eyes, once burning with restless fire, had dulled into the stare of someone who had carried too much for too long. And yet, when he held Frances in his arms, there was still love, aching, desperate love. But even that was not enough to anchor him anymore. The contradiction was final. Kurt Cobain, adored by millions, felt utterly alone. The boy who had spent his life screaming to be heard now wished for nothing more than silence. And silence, he believed, was finally coming. The echo that never faded. April 1994. Seattle. The house on Lake Washington Boulevard sat quietly behind its tall hedges. The world outside unaware that inside, a life was unraveling into silence. Kurt Cobain had returned home after vanishing from rehab, his mind a battlefield of contradictions. To the public, he was the voice of a generation. To himself, he was a prisoner of pain, drowning in a sea no fame or fortune could rescue him from. He wanted the house like a ghost. Some nights he wrote feverishly in his journals, filling page after page with fragments of thoughts. Pleas, regrets, anger, love. Other nights, he sat with his guitar, strumming the same aching progressions over and over, as if trying to summon one last song. A song no one else would ever hear. On April 5th, the battle ended. The details became headlines, dissected by police reports and tabloids. But the truth was simpler. Kurt chose silence over the unbearable roar of existence. He left behind a note addressed partly to his fans, partly to his childhood imaginary friend, and partly to himself. Its most haunting line echoed through time. It's better to burn out than fade away. 3 days later, an electrician discovered his body in the greenhouse above the garage. The news spread like wildfire. Radio stations interrupted their playlists, television anchors spoke with trembling voices, and fans across the globe wept as though they had lost a brother. Outside his home, mourners gathered, flowers, candles, guitars laid at the gates. Strangers clung to each other, united in the grief that felt both personal and historic. He was 27 years old. The world struggled to process the paradox. How someone who had given so much light to others could be swallowed by so much darkness. Young fans felt orphaned, as if the only person who had understood their pain had abandoned them. Parents were stunned, unsure how to comfort children who cried for a man they had never met. And musicians everywhere paused, realizing that the crown of genius could also be a crown of thorns. Courtney Love read fragments of his final note at a vigil, her voice breaking, her anger raw. Thousands of fans sobbed as she shouted at him. I don't think it takes away his dignity to say that he was a junkie, because that's one of the things he was. Her grief was fury. Her fury was grief. In the crowd, people screamed Kurt's name into the night, their cries echoing like unanswered prayers. For Frances, being just 20 months old, the tragedy was something she could not yet understand. A daughter would grow up with photographs, stories, and the weight of a father who would become a myth. Kurt's deepest fear, that he would fail her, had come true in the most permanent way, and yet his voice did not die. Smells like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Heart-Shaped Box, all apologies. The songs remained, pulsing through radios, whispering in bedrooms, blasting in headphones of kids, yet unborn when he lived. Each lyric carried not just his agony, but his truth. Each chord reminded the world that beauty could bloom from brokenness, that even despair could be transformed into art. Kurt Cobain became part of the 27 Club, alongside Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. But unlike most, his myth only grew larger with time. He was not just remembered as a rock star, but as a symbol of pain unmasked, of honesty unpolished, of the cost of being too raw for a world that demands armor. In the end, Kurt's story was not only about death, it was about connection. Millions who felt invisible found themselves reflected in his music. He had carried their pain as his own, and even though he could not escape it, he left behind a map for them to feel less alone. The boy from Aberdeen who never fit, who scribbled lyrics in the dark, had become eternal. His voice still drifts through generations like smoke after fire, reminding us of the fragile line between brilliance and despair. And though his life burned out, his echo never faded. Some voices are not meant to last forever, but to burn so brightly that they change everything around them. Kurt Cobain was not just a musician. He was not just a frontman of Nirvana. He was a mirror reflecting the pain, confusion, and loneliness of millions who thought no one could ever understand them. He gave shape to silence, melody to despair, and hope to the hopeless. But behind the anthems, behind the flannel and the fame, he was a boy from Aberdeen who only ever wanted peace. He gave everything he had, his voice, his soul, his truth. And in the end, that sacrifice consumed him. Kurt's story reminds us of the unbearable weight that often rests on the shoulders of those who feel too deeply. It is a warning about the cost of carrying other people's pain while drowning in your own. And yet, it is also a legacy, proof that even a fragile life can leave an indestructible echo. Today, decades after his passing, his songs are still alive. Teenagers discovering Nevermind for the first time still feel the same jolt of recognition that his fans did in 1991. His voice, broken yet defiant, continues to whisper to the misfits and the dreamers, you are not alone. Kurt Cobain burned out at 27, but he never faded away. His story is tragic, yes, but it is also eternal, because in every distorted chord, in every aching lyric, in every voice that dares to scream its truth, Kurt still lives. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a legend, not how long they walk this earth, but how deeply their footsteps still echo long after they are gone.